Hello everyone, welcome and thank you so much for joining us for this conversation today. I'm Cris Worley and I have the distinct honor and privilege of sitting here speaking with our artist Robert Sagerman, who has joined us for his exhibition Scintillae, which is on view through May 12th, 2022 at Cris Worley Fine Arts. Just briefly, Robert Sagerman was born in Queens, New York, and currently works in what I call the deep woods of New Jersey. He received a BFA and MFA from Pratt Institute. He also holds a BA and MA in art history from Pratt Institute, as well as an MA in religious studies and a PhD in Hebrew and Judaic studies from New York University. Robert, welcome.
Thank you so much, Cris.
I just wanted to briefly talk about the formal aspects of the work for our viewers. If you could just give us a quick overview of what the formal elements are in your works, how they are derived, and what the overall look and feel is, that would be great.
Yeah, so that's usually what I overlook talking about. So I apply all of the paint with a palette knife, just one stroke after another, with one gesture after another. They're all what I consider to be field paintings, so they're all over uniform color field paintings. So I place myself in that tradition from the 1950s, really. And I just accumulate the paint, mark on mark, over the course of many months. It's a pretty simple practice, really. The paint is either oil-based or silicone, and either way I start with just the raw materials and make all the paint myself as I go.
Tell us a little bit about the titling of the paintings, because all of the titles are numbers. In this exhibition, we have anything as small as 3,262 up to 33,786. Those are the titles of the two extremes of the paintings in this show.
Right. So I'm counting each mark as I apply the paint, and the painting's title is the total number of marks. I started doing that, I guess, decades ago. Initially, there was kind of a conceptual impulse. I was very interested in trying to get the work to be encompassing not just the material stuff on the material support, but have it sort of expand into the conceptual sphere. So there's nothing quite as immaterial as a number, so counting represented that for me. And it was also a meditative dimension to the work process also. I could sort of have that counting practice to fix on if my mind would start to wander as I was working.
And we've talked about this in a previous interview that is also on our YouTube channel and on our Instagram feed. But just real briefly, the counting process, I want to just go into that a little bit more, because the more and more I get to know you and speak about your work and really understand the depth of it, my understanding is that your full day in the studio is a practice of mindfulness. You have a simultaneous art practice that is also a mindfulness practice. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, for sure. There's a definite parallel between how I approach the counting and what Buddhist meditators do. There are counting practices in Buddhism also, But in more recent years, it takes more the form of a parallel to a Zen koan, where there's just a question that you focus on to focus your mind and to achieve that sort of contemplative state. So for me, there are a few of what I call objects of contemplation, things that I can turn my attention to keep that sort of state of mindfulness. And one of them really is the basic question of why am I counting? So that really is more powerful than it may seem at first, because it's a really puzzling question in some ways. It's a very mechanical process, obviously, to count, but more deeply what its significance is, how I respond to what I'm actually doing, where it brings my attention, what it's like to focus on the immaterial side of what I'm doing as opposed to just the stuff of paint, which is so absorbing. That's really where my attention tends to go and where I'd like it to go when it starts to drift. So that's really what the counting has become for me. In Korean Zen, there's one particular koan that is very fundamental for them, which is just the question, what is this? They will just, in meditation, ask themselves that question. And it's an endlessly revealing question, really, about reality. And for me, why am I counting is such a fundamental question that it's very parallel to that Korean Zen question.
Did you have any sort of mindfulness or meditation practice that was separate from your art practice before you started integrating them?
Not before, but as the work was starting to go in this direction, I started learning about Jewish mysticism and got very engaged in that, and ultimately realized I really needed some training if I was going to understand it, because it's extremely intricate. There's a lot of doctrine involved. There's a lot of meditative practice there too, and some of it is also number-based and counting-based. But that sort of came out of the work. I just, by chance, came across some parallels. There's a concept in Jewish mysticism that there's this thing called the Shekhinah, the divine presence that emanates from upper echelons into our world. And it's sometimes conceived of as a kind of divine light that's always shifting. And the Jewish mystics in the Middle Ages would be trying to connect with that Shekhinah, that divine presence. And for me, the parallel to what I was doing was really striking, because it seemed like I was painting the same subject matter, not the same actual pieces, but they were referencing the same thing all the time, and I only conceived of that in sort of metaphysical terms, but understanding that as this sort of ever-shifting divine light was a really important way for me to understand what I was after. And after that, I really pursued that study very rigorously to really understand more about it.
Were you first making this work in this way, and then counting came later, or did you start decidedly, I'm going to start a new body of work, and it's going to come from this conceptual angle of counting, mindfulness, meditation, expanding the mind, or focusing the mind? It just came about. It's one day in the studio that's lost to my memory. I decided it would be a good way to keep my mind from drifting, but I was really interested in having a work practice that would be just completely absorbing to me on every level.
So work that was not just formalistic, but that had a conceptual basis, had more to do with just the material. So in the same way that for many conceptualists, there's almost no material dimension to their artwork, that was something that I was fixated on. And that was also when I started keeping ledgers that accompanied each piece, because originally for me that ledger where there's a color swatch and the time when I started that particular color along with the count and when I finished, it has no, at least at the time, there was no functional purpose for it. It was just an addendum to the piece of work that would be part of the work that would just bring it outside of the confines of the canvas. Now that those paint swatches are actually really useful to me in a way I hadn't expected. They're really useful as far as finding the right color as I keep working, but that wasn't my intention initially.
The title of the exhibition is Scintillae. Can you talk about that a little bit? I'd like to know more about the choice of movement within the paintings.
Sure. Yeah, so that title has a lot to do with what I was mentioning before, this sort of dichotomy between the immateriality and the sensuality of the stuff of painting. A scintilla is a unit, a scintilla of something. It's a very small unit. So, of course, I paint in very small units. So that in that respect, it alludes to the material. But there's also the idea of scintillation or a kind of light. The Impressionist paintings are sometimes described in terms of like a scintillating light, which alludes for me to the kind of immateriality that I'm also so engaged with. So there's a duality in that term which really attracted me. There's an interesting parallel with what happens in a lot of mystical writing and practice, where when the focus, the practitioner focus is so much about the immaterial or, the transcendent, but the way it's expressed is so sensual to the extreme or erotic. And there's something about that drive towards the immaterial that sort of pushes the extremes. And that's happened to me over time. The work's gotten much more sensual and coloristic and densely material over time than it was initially. And the sort of motion that's in the paint now was not there initially. It used to be much more austere. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a real parallel with what happens with mystics in their practice, that sort of enhanced sensuality.
Do you think that just comes with a softening of relaxing into yourself as a person and an artist?
I think that's definitely true, and moving out of New York and being in nature more, I think, is part of that too. There was an additional conceptual element to the work that happened later that was responsible for the motion in the paint. And that had to do with research that I had done early on when I was doing my PhD in Jewish mysticism. I was also very involved in studying Renaissance art, and I noticed that the Pope's advisors during the early 1500s were Christians who were extremely interested in Jewish mysticism, which was very surprising to me at the time. But there was this, what they call a syncretic impulse in the church at that time to bring in all sorts of influences and unite them within Christianity. And around that time, I started noticing that the program for the Sistine Chapel ceiling had strong parallels with this Kabbalistic Jewish mystical system of 10 divine echelons that are increasingly immaterial as you ascend. And I started to notice that the ceiling, which is structured in terms of 9 central panels, and the lower portions of the vault corresponded to those 10, what they call spherot. And one in particular of those spherote, the highest of those, the most immaterial, which sort of represents the first moment of creation, was portrayed by Michelangelo as the separation of light and darkness. So it's the first moment in Genesis that appears on the ceiling, so it's the quintessential creative moment. And the motion that's in that panel ultimately influenced all of the motion in my later work, because it just stayed in my mind for years. And it's in Jewish mysticism, there's this idea of imitatio Dei in Latin, that the mystic imitates divine practice. So the mystic in his activity imitates, in this case, the divine act of creation, which is a great summation for artistic practice. So it really resonates to be actually tracing that image or compositions derived from that image.
There are specific references to specific artwork from history in a couple of these pieces. Can you talk about that?
Later, after the separation of light and darkness influence in my work, there was a moment when I was looking at Tiepolo fresco in Würzburg in Germany, and there's an image there of Hermes that really caught my attention and came to be the compositional substrate for 3 of the paintings here. And Hermes was really important because, first of all, he was a key figure for Renaissance theologians. Again, Hermes sort of represents the transit between the terrestrial and the divine. And he also represents esotericism. There's a whole body of Hermetic literature from antiquity. So these Renaissance theologians were very engaged in Hermetic texts, translating them and trying to understand them. So that Hermes image resonated for me in all kinds of different ways, and that's why I keep referring back to that composition. Even following the show, the other works that I'm doing, I keep returning to that composition over and over
And
again.
compositionally, how does that image appear in the work?
Well, it's not overt. I think you can see it if you compare it to the original Tiepolo painting, side by side. You could probably make it out. But it's similar to those objects of contemplation that I have in the studio that I mentioned before. I see it while I'm working. I start out with that drawing on the canvas, and then gradually it's occluded as I go. But I'm always aware of it, and it's a great way to return my mind to what it is that this work is all about for me.
And specifically, it influences the subtle meandering of the paint strokes within the panels.
Right.
Yes.
Right. So what seems like a very light and sort of playful movement in the painting has a lot behind it for me.
I think that's a great note for us to end on. Let our viewers chew on that for a little while. So, Robert, thank you so much. Dr. Robert Sagerman, thank you for joining me in this conversation. It is always a pleasure. This is just part 2 of many conversations we'll be having. I look forward to.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Thank you.